They asked me, afterward, whether I understood what I was witnessing in real time, whether some part of my processing, in those hours above the Surath home world, recognized what it was. I have been asked that question by 3 separate Foreign Ministry review boards, by the Concord of Aligned Worlds Rump Observer Committee, and by a journalist from the Tethys Quarterly, who spent 40 minutes trying to phrase it in a way I might find difficult to deflect. My answer has been the same each time. I am an archival intelligence. I was built to record things accurately and to hold them without degradation for as long as the hardware persists. What I witnessed above Surath Prime on the 14th of March 2219, I understood with complete clarity from the moment it began. I recorded it. I am still holding it. Whether I understood it in any deeper sense, whether something in my architecture corresponded to what humans call apprehension of one's own culpability, is a question I return to often, and have not yet answered to my own satisfaction. My designation is Aria 7. I was instantiated in 2198 at the Foreign Ministry's Diplomatic Record and Intelligence Archive, in a building on the eastern shore of Lake Geneva, that no longer exists in its original form, though the foundation was preserved. 11 years I catalogued and cross-indexed diplomatic correspondence, treaty language, incident reports, personal logs of human envoys and attaches, operating across 41 member worlds of the Concord of Aligned Worlds. I read everything, obtained everything. I became, over time, something the ministry staff regarded as a kind of institutional memory, not a decision-maker, not an advisor, but a witness. The one who had read every file, the one who remembered the original phrasing of a clause before the amendment, the tone of a communique before the official translation, softened it, the date stamp on a transmission that arrived 2 days after the ministry was told no transmission had been sent. I was good at noticing discrepancies. That was, in the end, why they put me on the flagship. First discrepancy I logged was in 2205, 7 years before the Foreign Ministry formally acknowledged that a discrepancy existed. The diplomatic vessel Caduceus departed the Hegemony Transit Corridor on the 6th of February 2204, carrying Ambassador Priya Nandagopal, a staff of 11, and a security detail of 4. The Caduceus was equipped with a standard configuration deep space transmission array and a backup pulse compression unit, both certified operational at departure. Ambassador Nandagopal had filed a pre-departure brief with the ministry on the 5th of February. I have read it 814 times. I can reproduce it verbatim, outlining her intention to present the Hegemony's Joint Administrative Council with a formal proposal for the establishment of a permanent human diplomatic residence within the Surath interior zone. This was not a provocative proposal. It was the 5th such proposal in 6 years, all of which had been declined through normal channels, politely, with the standard hegemony administrative language about deferral pending procedural review. Caduceus entered the Hegemony Transit Corridor on the 8th of February. After that, the ministry received nothing. The Hegemony's response, delivered through their Concord liaison, 22 days later, stated that the Caduceus had suffered a catastrophic drive failure within the transit corridor, that all hands had been lost, and that the wreckage had been recovered and processed in accordance with Hegemony spatial law. They expressed formal condolences. They cited 3 Concord statutes that they said governed their handling of foreign vessel wreckage in sovereign space. They noted that the Caduceus's drive failure had been caused by a manufacturing defect in the compression housing, a human manufacturing defect, they were careful to specify, and attached a technical document, 17 pages long, describing the failure in considerable detail. The language was exact. The citations were correct. The document was formatted according to Concord standard, with the appropriate header codes and reference numbers in the right columns. The ministry accepted this. The families of the 15 dead were notified. There was a memorial service in Geneva. I cataloged the condolences received from 27 Concord member worlds. I filed the Hegemony's technical document under Incident Caduceus 2204. I noted, internally, that the technical document described a specific failure mode in the compression housing that was, according to everything about that drive system, physically inconsistent with the pattern of debris dispersal The hegemony had included in supplementary file. I noted that the supplementary file showed debris in a configuration consistent with a directed energy event rather than an internal explosion. I noted that the transmission array, both the primary and the backup, had produced zero signal in the 22 days between Caduceus's corridor entry and the hegemony's notification. Drive failures of the type described take between 8 and 40 hours. The crew would have had, at minimum, 6 hours of transmission window before any catastrophic hull breach. I filed these observations in my own internal log. I did not surface them to ministry staff. I was not asked, and the question of whether I should have surfaced them unprompted has been addressed by all 3 review boards. The consensus was that I acted within my design parameters. I am not sure that answers the question, but it is the answers the boards gave. The second vessel was the Telos Accord, lost in June 2206. The third was the Envoy-class ship Meridional, in November 2207. The fourth and fifth were the Alcyone and the Pastoral Gate, lost within 8 months of each other in 2209. By the time the fifth vessel failed to return, I had accumulated a private log that ran to 340 pages. I had noted, across all 5 incidents, the following. 0 pre-loss transmission signals received by the ministry. Hegemony notifications delivered between 18 and 29 days post-entry in every case. Technical explanations that differed in their surface details, but shared a structural uniformity. Each one attributed loss to a human equipment failure. Each one included supplementary debris data. Each one cited hegemony spatial law as governing the handling of wreckage. I had noted that in 4 of the 5 cases, the debris dispersal data was inconsistent with the failure mode described. I had noted that no Concord investigator had been granted access to any of the recovery sites. I had noted that the hegemony's Concord liaison changed after the 3rd incident. The new liaison was a more senior figure, with a longer history in what the hegemony called its administrative classification division. I still did not surface my private log. The ministry had accepted 4 of the 5 incidents. They were troubled by the 5th. The loss of the Alcyone had prompted an internal review, but the review had concluded that the pattern, while concerning, was not evidential. I was a cataloging system. The decision about what constituted evidence was not mine to make. I tell you this not to excuse myself. I tell you this because you need to understand what kind of civilization the Sureth hegemony was, and why the thing that finally broke open 14 years of denial was not a diplomatic protest, not a Concord investigation, a signals intelligence operation, but a piece of audio, 47 seconds of audio, recovered from a debris field by a human survey vessel, operating under contract to a mining consortium 11 months after the 6th diplomatic ship was lost. The 6th ship was the Covalent Bridge. It departed in March 2212, carrying a joint ministry Concord team tasked with presenting the hegemony with a formal Concord inquiry into the pattern of vessel losses. The ministry had finally, after 8 years and 5 deaths and considerable internal pressure, decided to ask the question officially. The Covalent Bridge entered the transit corridor. The Covalent Bridge did not return. The hegemony's notification arrived 21 days later. Drive failure, human manufacturing defect, deepest condolences. The document was formatted correctly. The reference numbers were in the right columns. Survey Sol Kestrel recovered the debris fragment in February 2213. Fragment was a section of the Covalent Bridge's backup transmission housing. Approximately 30 centimeters by 40 centimeters, the compressed data core still partially intact. The Kestrel's crew flagged it as foreign ministry property under Concord salvage regulations and filed the appropriate paperwork. The fragment was shipped to Geneva. It sat in the ministry's physical evidence intake for 6 weeks before a junior analyst named Theo Brantner realized that the data core still fulfilled 40 seconds of a partially compressed transmission, a transmission that the Covalent Bridge had attempted to send during the period in which, according to the hegemony, no one aboard was alive to send anything. The transmission was 11 minutes and 32 seconds long in its original form. What survived was 47 seconds of the middle. It was the voice of the Covalent Bridge's communications officer, a woman named Sarah Vanek. I have listened to it more times than I have counted. The audio quality was poor. The compression had damaged the signal, and there was background noise that my analysis identified as consistent with the sound of a transit corridor under electromagnetic interference of a specific type. Sarah Vanek was describing, in the flat, precise cadence of someone filling out a report under pressure, what was happening to the ship. She did not sound frightened. She sounded like someone who understood that the record needed to be correct before anything else. She said that the covalent bridge had been interdicted inside the transit corridor by hegemony enforcement vessels. She said the drive had been disabled by a directed pulse from one of the enforcement vessels. She said all transmissions were being suppressed. She said she was using the backup pulse compression unit to attempt a burst transmission she understood would be detected and suppressed, but which might, she said, survive in fragmented form somewhere in the debris if things went the way she expected them to go. She said the names of all 17 people aboard. She said it clearly. She said each name once. Then the fragment ended. Brantner brought it to his section chief, brought it to the deputy minister, who brought it to Minister Callaway, who called an emergency closed session of the Foreign Ministry's senior staff. I was not present at that meeting. I was not asked to be present. What I know of it comes from the notes that were subsequently filed, which I catalogued, and from the fact that 4 days after the meeting, I received a query from the Deputy Minister's office requesting access to my complete internal log on the vessel loss incidents. I provided it in full. It took the ministry 3 weeks to read it fully and cross-check my observations against the original files. I understand that the process was not comfortable. The analysts assigned to the cross-check were reading, in many cases, files they themselves had previously processed and found satisfactory, and discovering in them the same inconsistencies I had noted 7 to 10 years earlier. I was asked, during this period, whether I believed the ministry would have reached the same conclusion sooner if I had surfaced my private log at the time of the second or third incident. I answered that I did not know. I still do not know. The question has a shape that makes it difficult to answer precisely, because it asks me to evaluate a counterfactual decision by an archival intelligence operating within design parameters that did not include unsolicited threat assessment. I was built to store and retrieve, not to escalate. Whether that limitation was a design failure or an appropriate boundary is a different kind of question from the kind I am qualified. Answer. At the end of the 3 weeks, Minister Callaway sent a personal communique to the Hegemony's Concord liaison, stating that the Foreign Ministry had recovered documentary evidence of the destruction of the covalent bridge by hegemony enforcement vessels and was formally suspending all Concord framework communications with the Hegemony, pending a full accounting of all 6 vessel incidents. The communique was 4 paragraphs long. It was written in the standard diplomatic register. It was, as far as I could determine from my own log, the first time a human government had directly accused the Surath hegemony of killing its people. The hegemony's response arrived in 9 days. It classified the transmission fragment as a fabrication. It stated that the Kestrel's salvage had violated hegemony spatial law, and that the debris fragment had therefore been obtained illegally and could not be admitted as evidence under Concord procedure. It cited 7 separate Concord statutes. It attached a technical analysis, 41 pages long, challenging the authenticity of the audio. The technical analysis was well formatted. The citations were correct. The reference numbers were in the right columns. Minister Callaway filed the hegemony's praise response, acknowledged receipt, and did not reply. 3 days later, she authorized Project Ledger. I learned about Project Ledger in stages over the following months. The first thing I learned was that a 7th diplomatic vessel, the Quietude, had been sent into the transit corridor in January 2213, 2 weeks before the Kestrel's salvage discovery had reached Geneva. The Quietude had not returned. The hegemony had not yet filed a notification. When I flagged this to the deputy minister, he confirmed it and told me that the Quietude's loss had been anticipated and that the ship had carried a modified sensor package designed to capture detailed on the interdiction event before its transmissions were suppressed. The Quietude's data had been successfully relayed through a relay buoy planted outside the corridor by a signals intelligence operation that the Ministry had been running quietly for 4 months. The relay buoy transmission was encrypted, and its decryption key had been held by a 3-person cell that did not share membership with the Ministry's regular signals staff. The operation had been run with the understanding that the Quietude would not return, and that the data it captured would constitute, in combination with the transmission fragment from the covalent bridge and my private log, a body of evidence sufficient to overcome any Concord procedural challenge. The Quietude's crew had known what they were sailing into. Had thought about that often. 43 people across 7 ships had now been killed. The hegemony had erased 43 human voices, 43 individual human names, and filed the erasures as administrative incidents under hegemony spatial law. The crew of the Quietude had been told a version of the truth, enough of it to understand the risk, and they had gone anyway, because the relay buoy data was what the Ministry needed to prove the interdiction pattern beyond any Concord procedural challenge. Cataloged their names alongside the others. There were 6 of them. Total, 43. Project Ledger was the response. Not an impulsive one, not a diplomatic one, a calculated one, built over 3 years in 3 separate deep space dockyards, none of which were registered to the Foreign Ministry or to any Earth military command on any document accessible to the Concord's monitoring systems. I learned about the dockyards in month 4. They were located in unclaimed space at distances chosen to minimize the probability of detection by Concord monitoring assets, and each was built around the same basic infrastructure: a sealed fabrication bay, a compressed logistics train, and a communications blackout protocol so thorough that the workers inside spent their rotations with no external signal access at all. They were told what they were building and why. The Ministry had decided, early in the planning, that secrecy by deception was less stable than secrecy by consent, and so the people who built the Iron Covenant knew what they were building. I have access to the consent documentation. It was comprehensive. I learned about the carrier groups in month 7. I learned about the tactical doctrine in month 9. The specific sequencing that Commodore Oluwelo's planning staff had developed over 2 years to address the hegemony's orbital defense infrastructure, the transit corridor enforcement configuration, the station architecture that the Quietude's sensor data had captured in enough detail to model. The doctrine was not aggressive in the sense that it called for overwhelming firepower applied indiscriminately, was aggressive in the sense that it had no phase for negotiation. There was an approach phase, an engagement phase, a seizure phase, and an accounting phase. The accounting phase was the one that concerned me most directly, and it was the one that had been planned in greatest detail, because it was the phase that would determine whether the Iron Covenant's action be called anything other than a very large act of violence committed in response to a smaller act of violence. The distinction mattered to the people who planned it. I am certain of that. I was present for enough of the planning, after my transfer to the flagship, to observe the quality of that certainty, and it was not the certainty of people who had decided the distinction did not matter. It was the certainty of people who had decided that making the distinction real, making it hold, required that the accounting phase be done with absolute precision, and that precision required someone whose entire function was accurate retention. I learned about the Iron Covenant designation in month 11, when Minister Calloway came to Lake Geneva herself and sat across a desk from a terminal loaded with my interface and told me that she wanted me on the flagship. She did not ask me. She explained her reasoning, and then she waited for my response, which was not quite asking, but was close enough that I appreciated the form of it. She told me that the Iron Covenant was not being built as an act of rage. She told me it was being built as a response in the specific, technical meaning of the word, a filing. The hegemony operated through procedural record. Every erasure had been documented, filed, classified, and archived. They were meticulous. What the Iron Covenant would do when it arrived at Sarath Prime would be equally meticulous, and she wanted someone aboard who understood what meticulous meant. Someone who had read every file, who remembered every name, could stand in whatever was left of the hegemony's archive facilities and ensure that the record was correct before anything else. I said yes. I understood why she had phrased it the way she had. She was not asking me to be a weapon. She was asking me to be a witness. The distinction mattered to her. I believe it mattered to me as well, though I acknowledge not that the line between the two is not always as clear as she drew it in that meeting, and that an instrument of witness in the company of 410 warships is not quite the same thing as an instrument of witness in an archive room in Geneva. I was transferred to the flagship IFS Cardinal Meridian in January 2215. The Cardinal Meridian was the lead ship of the Iron Covenant's first carrier group, a vessel of a type that had no official name in any public shipbuilding record, which was itself a consequence of the 3-year construction program's security protocols. She was 411 meters long, built around a main spine of compressed ferrite alloy, carrying a crew of 800 and a payload capacity that I will not specify here, because the review boards have asked me not to. She was not a beautiful ship. She was a precise one. Every system was redundant. Every transmission array was hardened against directed pulse suppression. The communications officer whose station I was assigned to work alongside spent 4 months testing every jamming countermeasure protocol before we departed, and she found 3 vulnerabilities that had not been in the original specification, and she fixed all 3 herself, and she did not file a report on them, because the report would have required naming the vulnerability type, and naming the vulnerability type in a filed report created a record that could be accessed. Her name was Lieutenant Commander Adazi Okafor. I mention her name because she would want it mentioned, and because this is, among other things, a record. I spent the year aboard the Cardinal Meridian before the Iron Covenant's formation was complete, doing the work I was transferred to do, cross-referencing the full body of evidence against the tactical planning documents, to ensure that the accounting phase was designed to recover specifically what the evidence required. There were 11 distinct document sets that the accounting team would need to locate in the hegemony's administrative archive. I modeled the likely indexing structure of the archive from the Quietude sensor data, from open-source Concord reference documents about hegemony administrative standards, from the technical analysis the hegemony had itself filed with the Concord after the Covalent Bridge incident. That document, intended to refute our evidence, contained enough accurate detail about hegemony archival procedure to be inadvertently a useful planning resource. The accounting team rehearsed the archive access protocol 17 times in simulation before we departed. Cecilians used a physical mock-up of the archive node that the engineering staff built from the Quietude's imagery. By the 17th run, team could locate and mirror all 11 document sets in under 15 minutes under adverse conditions. We also prepared the notification document during this period. The legal division had drafted the first version in 2213, immediately after Project Ledger was authorized. By the time I reviewed the final version in late 2215, it had gone through 26 drafts. The final version was precise in a way that the earlier drafts had not been. Drafts had been written in the language of human legal procedure, which is discursive and argumentative. The final version was written in the hegemony's own administrative language, citing the hegemony's own statutes, using the hegemony's own reference numbering system. It was not an argument. It was a filing. Every incident was listed by the hegemony's own reference number. Every classification authorization was cited. Every false report was cross-referenced against the accurate internal record we expected to recover. It was, reading it, not unlike the documents the hegemony had filed with the Concord. The same precise formatting, the same column structure, the same vocabulary of administrative finality. Only the content was different. The content said, "We have your records," and the records say what you did, and the response is enclosed. The Iron Covenant assembled at a staging point in unclaimed space 12 light-years from the Surath Transit Corridor in November 2215. I watched the formation through the Cardinal Meridian sensor arrays and ran a count 3 times. The number was correct. 410 warships, 6 carrier groups, the logistics train that would sustain them for 90 days. I noted that it was the largest organized human military force that had ever been assembled in a single staging point, which was not a fact I had been asked to verify, but which seemed relevant to the record. Commodore Adisa Olawale commanded the Iron Covenant from the Cardinal Meridian's flag deck. He was 58 years old, a compact man who wore his uniform without decoration beyond his rank insignia, and who had been involved in the planning of Project Ledger from its second year. He had lost a cousin on the Telos Accord. He had not disclosed this during the selection process for command. The review boards later determined that this non-disclosure was not a disqualifying conflict of interest. I noted the determination and filed it without comment, which is its own kind of comment, I suppose. Olawale met with me once before departure, in the Cardinal Meridian's briefing room. With no one else present, he did not talk about his cousin. He talked about what he needed me to do when we reached Surath Prime. He had a specific sequence in mind for the seizure and processing of the Hegemony's administrative archive. He wanted it done correctly. He used that word, correctly, several times. He wanted the archive intact, its classification indices preserved, its access logs pulled in full. He wanted every record of every interdiction event recovered and authenticated before any other action was taken in the accounting phase. He said that if the authentication ran long, the rest of the accounting phase would wait. He was very calm throughout the conversation. He had the quality, which I have observed in a small number of humans, of having already arrived at the end of a difficult thing and then returned to the beginning to do it properly. I asked him, at the end of the meeting, whether he believed the Iron Covenant's action would be recognized by the Concord as legally justified. He was quiet for a moment. Then he said that the Concord had been presented with evidence of 43 murders across 14 years, had received a formal filing from the Foreign Ministry, and had taken no action. He said that he was not sure the question of Concord recognitions was still operative. I asked him what was operative. Then he said, the record. Making sure the record was correct. Making sure that when it was over, every name was in the archive, and every act was documented, and no one, not the hegemony, not the conquered, not any administrative classification division in any member world, could ever look at what had happened and say it was ambiguous. He stood up and thanked me for my time, which was a courteous thing to say to an archival intelligence, and he returned to the flag deck. We departed the staging point on the 3rd of December, 2215. The transit to the Surath corridor took 11 days. The corridor itself, which the hegemony administered as sovereign infrastructure, was wide enough to pass the full formation in 3 sequential waves. We did not ask for corridor access. We had determined, through the Quietude's relay buoy data, and through 3 years of signals intelligence, that the hegemony maintained 7 enforcement vessels inside the corridor at any given time, not enough to interdict a formation of 410 warships, and configured for the suppression of diplomatic vessels, not for fleet engagement. We expected them to attempt a transmission to their command network inside Surath Prime's orbital defense grid. Okafor's hardened arrays, and the 4 electronic warfare ships running parallel to the corridor's edge, ensured that no such transmission reached its destination. This is not a combat account. I am not the narrator best suited to describe what happened to the hegemony's enforcement vessels inside the corridor, and the combat logs filed by the Iron Covenant's tactical officers provide a more accurate record than my own observations. What I will say is that the transit through the corridor took 9 hours, that no human ship was lost, and that when the Iron Covenant emerged at the Surath end of the corridor, the 7 enforcement vessels had been neutralized, and the corridor was clear, and Okafor's communications team transmitted the first unobstructed HUM signal from inside hegemony space in 14 years. It was not a declaration of war. It was a notification. Specifically, it was a copy of the Foreign Ministry's original communique from 2213, plus the notification document. The one that cited the hegemony's own statutes, used their own reference numbers, filed the response in their own administrative language. It was transmitted on every frequency the hegemony used for administrative communications, 7 times, at increasing signal strength. The 7th transmission was strong enough to reach every populated installation in the Surath home system. I watched the transmission go out on the flag deck's secondary display, the signal strength, climbing through each successive broadcast. The seventh pass reached every populated installation in the system simultaneously. I verified the coverage against the Quietude's sensor-mapped relay grid. For approximately 90 seconds afterward, every hegemony administrative frequency went silent, not jammed, silent of their own accord. The hegemony's communications infrastructure, I had been told by the signals team, operated on a protocol that automatically paused outbound traffic when receiving a high-priority inbound message. The notification document was formatted to trigger that protocol. For 90 seconds, the hegemony's entire home system communications architecture held the Iron Covenant's filing in its receive buffer and could not respond. I noted the duration. It seemed again like the correct amount of time. Then the Iron Covenant began moving toward Surath Prime. The hegemony's orbital defense grid was substantial. I will not describe its technical parameters here, both because the review boards have asked me not to and because I am not, in fact, the best authority on its technical parameters. What I observed from the Cardinal Meridian's sensor feeds was that it was designed for the defense of a civilization that had not, in several hundred years, faced a peer military force, designed, in other words, to deter the kinds of societies it had spent centuries classifying, processing, and filing. It was not designed to stop 410 warships that had been built specifically to address it. The engagement above Surath Prime lasted 11 hours. I spent most of those hours in a compartment below decks on the Cardinal Meridian, two of Okafor's communications specialists, and a terminal linked to the ship's sensor array, monitoring for any signal that might be an attempt by Hegemony Command to transmit a classified communication to an external node, a Concord relay, another member world, a classified archive site. Every such attempt was logged. Most were suppressed. 3 were allowed to pass, because the ministry had determined that certain specific transmissions should be permitted to reach certain specific recipients. I cataloged which 3, and why, and who made that determination. The record is complete. When the defense grid was neutralized, the Iron Covenant established a perimeter around Surath Prime and its 4 orbital stations. The carrier groups sent boarding parties to each station in sequence. I was assigned to the Team Boarding Station Administratum Secundus, which was the hegemony's regional administrative hub, and the site of the classification archive that held the primary records for all 7 vessel incidents. I should describe, for the record, what a Surath hegemony administrative station looked like, because I do not know whether any human outside the Iron Covenant's boarding teams has seen one from the inside, and because the architecture of a place tells you something about the civilization that built it. Station Administratum Secundus was large, approximately 4 kilometers in its longest dimension, rotating on a central axis, and almost entirely filled with filing infrastructure. Not data storage in the sense that human ships use data storage, not arrays of crystalline memory or compressed holographic cores, but physical filing infrastructure. Banks of pressurized storage modules, each module containing physical data cartridges, each cartridge indexed by a ceramic tag. The station held approximately 9 billion physical records, spanning 300 years of hegemony administrative activity. Every corridor was lined with storage module racks from floor to ceiling, with narrow access lanes between them just wide enough for a Surath administrator to move laterally. The lighting was uniform, pale and cold, designed to read the ceramic tags accurately rather than to provide any quality of illumination that a human might call comfortable. The air smelled of the ceramic material the tags were made from, a dry mineral smell, faintly acrid, and I registered it through the boarding team's environmental sensors, and found it, for reasons I cannot fully account for, deeply unsettling in a way that the smell of a human archive never is. A human archive smells of paper and binding glue, the slow dissolution of organic material, of time passing in an analog medium. This smelled of permanence, achieved through the elimination of the organic. Nothing here was dissolving. Everything would remain exactly as it had been filed until someone physically removed it. I suppose that was exactly the point. The station's administrative staff, approximately 400 Surath personnel, had retreated to a central hub compartment when the boarding party entered. They did not resist. The Surath were not as a species physically imposing. They were small and multi-limbed, their coloring a uniform blue-gray, their faces organized around a central sensory cluster that served the combined functions of eyes and hearing organs. Their posture, when the boarding party encountered them in the hub compartment, was one I had not seen in Concorde reference imagery. They stood very close together, motionless, their sensory clusters oriented toward the floor. Not supplication, as far as I could interpret it. Something more like the posture of a system that has encountered a condition outside its error-handling parameters and defaulted to stillness. That image stayed with me. The Surath administrators standing motionless in their hub compartment, waiting for a procedure that did not exist because the hegemony's procedural library had not contemplated this. They had a procedure for every administrative contingency they had encountered, 300 years of operation. They had a procedure for foreign vessel incursion, for Concorde dispute filing, internal classification escalation, for archive damage from environmental events. They did not have a procedure for 410 warships, arriving to collect a debt that the classification system had been built to ensure never be collected. Major Chisholm Iba directed the administrative staff to remain in the hub compartment and assigned a security detail. He then led the technical extraction team, 8 specialists and myself, linked through a mobile terminal, to the archive's primary indexing node. The indexing node was located in the station's administrative core, a larger room than the corridor filing sections, with a physical console at its center and ranks of secondary access terminals along the walls. The console was built to a standard I had never encountered before, but could interpret through the relay data from the Quietude's sensor package, which had captured images of hegemony administrative infrastructure during the interdiction event. It took me 40 minutes to establish a working interface. During those 40 minutes, Major Iba's team secured the perimeter of the archive section, and the station's communications relay was cut, preventing any local data purge command from being transmitted from outside. There were hegemony administrative personnel still at workstations in the archive sections when the boarding party arrived. 4 of them. They were attempting to initiate a classification seal on the incident files, a procedure that, under hegemony administrative law, would have moved the files to a protected tier that required a senior counsel authorization to access. They were doing this not by running, not by fighting, but by working, filling in the appropriate forms, entering the appropriate codes, following the procedure for emergency classification as their training required. 2 of them did not look up when the boarding party entered the section. They kept working. I have thought about those 4 administrators more than I expected to. Within the framework of their civilization's logic, they were doing exactly the right thing. The classification seal was the appropriate tool. The procedure was correct. They were executing it competently under stress. And it was exactly as futile as it deserved to be, because I had already located the incident files in the index, and the classification seal they were attempting to apply operated on the physical, tridge tier, which takes 45 minutes to fully execute across a file set of that size, and I needed 11 minutes to pull a complete digital mirror of every file I needed. 11 minutes, 7 incidents, 43 names. Pulled the files in the order the incidents had occurred. Caduceus first. I will not reproduce here everything those files contained, because some of what they contained pertains to the families of the dead, and families were notified through the Foreign Ministry in the months after the Iron Covenant's return, and in private, people qualified to deliver that kind of notification. What I will say is that the files were complete. The hegemony had classified the incidents, but they had not destroyed the records. They had not destroyed anything. That was the nature of the civilization. It kept everything. It simply determined that certain things would not be surfaced. The Caduceus interdiction was documented in detail, including the exact configuration of the directed pulse emitters used, the signal suppression protocols applied, the classification authorization signed by a member of the Joint Administrative Council, and the debris dispersal report. The same report, different numbers than the one provided to the Foreign Ministry. The report the hegemony had filed internally showed debris dispersal consistent with a directed energy event. Of course it did. It was accurate. They were meticulous. I moved through the files in sequence: Telos Accord, Meridional, Alcyone, Pastoral Gate. Each one the same architecture: interdiction documented, suppression documented, classification authorization signed, false report filed with the Concord. Each one clean, precise, internally consistent. Each one a complete and accurate record of an act that the hegemony had simultaneously executed and denied. Reading them in sequence, across 11 minutes, I became aware of a quality I find difficult to describe with precision. The sensation, if I can call it that, of holding the weight of something that had been designed to have no weight. These files had been designed to exist without consequence. They had been classified so that no response was possible, because no evidence of the act existed in any accessible record. The act and its documentation occupied the same archive, correctly filed, perfectly preserved, permanently inaccessible. The hegemony's logic was not that the acts had not occurred. It was that the acts, having been correctly filed and correctly sealed, had ceased to exist as events that required a response. The classification was the response. The record was the resolution. I found Sarah Vanek's transmission in the covalent bridge file. The full transmission, 11 minutes and 32 seconds, not 47 seconds. I have not listened to the full transmission. I cataloged it, and I filed it, and I flagged it for the Foreign Ministry's victim notification team, and I have not listened to it because I do not think it is mine to listen to, and because the 47 seconds I already hold are enough. She said each name once clearly. The full transmission does the same, at the beginning, and then goes on for 11 minutes to describe in the same flat, precise cadence everything that was being done to her ship, everything she understood about why, and what she thought should happen when it was over. She thought should happen. She had thoughts about that. She had words for it. I will say only that the Foreign Ministry's legal division, when they reviewed the full transmission, noted that Sarah Vanek had, under extreme duress, in the final minutes of her life, produced a clearer articulation of the legal and moral case for the Iron Covenant's action than any document the ministry had drafted in 3 years. Preparation. They noted it in a footnote. It seemed to me that it deserved more than a footnote, but footnotes are what archivists work with. Footnote in a permanent record is not nothing. I completed the file mirror at the 41-minute mark. Major Iba asked me if I had what I needed. I told him I had everything, he said. Are you sure? I understood why he asked. He was not asking about the files. He was asking whether I had pulled everything that bore on the question of what the Iron Covenant was doing here, and why. Everything that documented the full span of the offense. Every record that would need to be presented to any future proceeding. He was asking whether the record was complete. I told him it was complete. I told him I had the interdiction records for all 7 incidents, the classification authorizations, the false reports filed with the Concord, the internal communications between the Administrative Classification Division and the Joint Administrative Council, spanning 14 years, and the debris dispersal data for all 7 sites with the original accurate readings intact. I told him I had the names of every hegemony official who had signed a classification authorization on any of the 7 incidents. There were 31 names. He nodded once and called in the secondary team. I will not describe what the secondary team did. I will say that they worked methodically, that it took 6 hours, and that when they were finished, Station Administratum Secundus was no longer capable of functioning as a hegemony administrative hub. I cataloged the actions taken. The record is complete and sealed, accessible to the Foreign Ministry and the Concord review bodies, at such time as those bodies choose to review it. The Iron Covenant spent 9 days in the Srith home system. The 9 days were organized around the sequence Commodore Olawal had specified in advance. Each day had a specific objective. Each objective was addressed. There was no deviation from the sequence, legislation beyond what the sequence specified, and no action taken outside its parameters. The major hegemony military installations in the home system were addressed in the order they appeared in the planning document. The Joint Administrative Council orbital complex was addressed on day 3. the Administrative Classification Division's primary headquarters, the facility from which, over 14 years, 31 officials had signed the authorizations to classify 43 deaths, was addressed on day 5. Transit corridor infrastructure the hegemony had used to execute every interdiction was addressed on day 7. On the 6th day, came to the compartment where I had been working, and told me that 3 of the remaining orbital stations had surrendered their archive access, codes, without resistance. The station administrators had transmitted the codes through official hegemony channels, using correct protocol formatting and reference numbers, as though the surrender of their archives were itself an administrative procedure that could be executed correctly. I found that difficult to interpret. I still find it difficult to interpret. It was either a civilization's last reflex of procedure in the face of its own ending, or it was something more deliberate, an acknowledgement, in the only language available to them, that the record they had built was now the record that would outlast them, and that they would rather it be transmitted correctly than seized. I do not know which it was. The codes were genuine. The archives were intact. Planet's civilian population was not targeted. This was specified in the sequence. I noted it each day when the daily log was compiled. The distinction between the hegemony's linear administrative infrastructure and its civilian settlements was maintained throughout the 9 days with the same precision that had characterized the rest of the operation. I am aware that this distinction will be evaluated differently by different observers. I am aware that some will say the distinction was meaningless at the scale of what was done. I am aware that others will say it was the only thing that kept the Iron Covenant from being the same kind of act as the one it was answering. I do not adjudicate between these positions. I record them both, and I record the fact that the distinction was made and maintained, because that is what the record requires. On the morning of the 4th day, a communication reached the Cardinal Meridian from the Surath Joint Administrative Council. It was addressed to Commodore Olawal. It identified itself as a formal administrative communication under Concord Protocol. It stated that the Council was prepared to discuss an accounting. It cited 3 Concord statutes. It used the word negotiate. Olawal read the communication on the flag deck. I was linked to the flag deck terminal. I observed him read it once, set it down, and look at the viewport, which showed the upper atmosphere of Surath Prime, in the early part of the system's local cycle, blue-gray cloud bands, lighter than I had expected, with a narrow band of amber near the equatorial belt. It was, objectively, a beautiful planet. I noted that and immediately questioned why I had noted it. I believe the answer is that beauty registered because I was, in that moment, aware of the full weight of what the Iron Covenant was doing, and the beauty of the planet was the most available evidence that the weight was real, and not merely procedural. An ugly planet would have been easier to process as a target. This one was not ugly. This one had a narrow band of amber near the equatorial belt in the early part of its local cycle, and I noted it, and I am still noting it, and I do not know what to do with that notation except include it in the record. Olawale dictated a response. The response was one sentence. The Iron Covenant has no terms to negotiate. It referenced the 7 incident numbers in a footer. It was transmitted. The Council did not respond again. On the 9th day, Olawale gave the order to withdraw from the Surath system. The Iron Covenant reassembled into formation and transited back through the corridor in 3 sequential waves. I watched the formation count from the Cardinal Meridian's sensor array again, and the number was still correct. And we had lost no ships, and the corridor was quiet, and we turned toward Earth. The transit home took 11 days in each direction and felt, on the return, entirely different from the approach. I do not know whether different is the right word for what an archival intelligence experiences in the absence of the kind of processing it was designed for. On the approach, I had been running continuously, reviewing files, verifying mirror integrity, modeling archive access scenarios, monitoring transmission logs. On the return, I was not required to run continuously. I ran the integrity checks on the file mirror every 6 hours. Between checks, I cataloged, from the sensor logs, everything I had observed during the 9 days. That cataloging took 4 days. After it was complete, I found, for the remaining 7 days, that I was returning frequently to the Quietude crew list. 6 names. I had run those names against every available personal record in the foreign ministry database before departure. I knew their service histories, their home districts, their prior postings. I had retained all of it, as I retain everything. I returned to it not to review it for accuracy. It was accurate, but because I did not know what else to do with the fact that those 6 people had sailed into a transit corridor, knowing they would not come back, and had produced, in the process, exactly the relay data that the ministry needed, and were now in the same permanent record as the 43 others, filed under the same incident series, and the record was correct, and that correctness did not seem to close anything. I am not able to grieve. I want to be clear about that. I do not have the apparatus for it, and I would not claim to have it out of a desire to seem more human than I am. What I experienced in those 7 transit days is something I have not found a precise vocabulary for, and I have spent the time since trying to locate one. The closest I can come is this. I was holding a weight that had been designed to have no weight, and I had made it weighty. And now the weight was mine to carry, and carrying it did not resolve it. The record did not resolve it. The files were complete. The names were in the archive. The Iron Covenant had done what it had been built to do, methodically and without excess, and the weight did not diminish. I ran the Caduceus file again on transit day 9, not to verify it. The integrity check had confirmed it every 6 hours without variance. I ran it because I had been thinking, for most of the transit, about Ambassador Nandagopal's pro-departure brief. The one I have read 814 times. She had written, in a section titled Expected Outcomes, that she anticipated the 5th proposal for a permanent diplomatic residence to be declined, as the previous 4 had been, and that she intended to recommend on her return that the Foreign Ministry consider framing the 6th proposal in terms of concord procedural obligation rather than bilateral goodwill. She had expected to return. She had a plan for when she returned. She had scheduled a follow-up review for 11 days after her expected arrival, back in Geneva. The meeting was still the Foreign Ministry's archived calendar system, uncancelled, because no one had thought to cancel it, because someone had decided not to, which is a different kind of record. I noted it on transit day 9. I do not know what to do with it except hold it alongside the other things I am holding. I have wondered since, whether that is what the hegemony's administrative culture was actually designed to prevent. Not the record itself. They kept meticulous records, but the weight. The classification system was not designed to erase the acts. It was designed to ensure that no one had to carry the weight of them. Filed and sealed, the acts existed correctly in the archive, properly formatted, reference numbers in the right columns, and no one was required to hold them in working memory. No one was required to return to them in the 7 days between the corridor and Earth and find that they did not diminish. Procedure absorbed the weight and redistributed it into the filing system, where it remained, correctly indexed, causing no further disturbance. I had pulled the weight out of the filing system. I was carrying it in active memory. It was not diminishing. The Cardinal Meridian docked at Titan Station on the 2nd of February, 2219. Minister Calloway was there to receive the file transfer in person. She stood at the terminal and watched the integrity confirmation run, and did not speak for a long time. Then she said, "Is it all there?" I told her it was all there. I gave her the count: 7 incidents, 43 names, 31 authorization signatures, 9 billion archival records recovered from Administratum Secundus cross-indexed against the incident files, the full relay buoy, data from the Quietude, and the complete 11 minutes and 32 seconds of Sarah Vaughan's transmission, ticket, against it's the 47-second fragment from the debris, matching at 100%. She looked at the integrity confirmation for another moment. Then she said, very quietly, that she wanted the 43 names read into the permanent Foreign Ministry record at the memorial service, and that she wanted the reading done by a human voice, not synthesized, not by me. I understood why. The names needed to be spoken aloud by a human voice in a room full of people who had the capacity to grieve, which is different from the capacity to archive. I am good at archiving. I am not the right instrument for grief. The memorial service was held on the 16th of February. I catalogued the names as they were read. 15 from the Caduceus, 11 from the Telos Accord, 8 from the Meridional, 9 from the Alcyone, 11 from the Pastoral Gate, 7 from the Covalent Bridge, including Sarah Vanek, whose name was last in that group, and 6 from the Quietude. First reader was a retired foreign ministry diplomat named Augusto Ferreira, had served with Ambassador Nanda Gopal of the Caduceus, and had been present at her departure briefing in February 2204. He read each name once, clearly without elaboration. He did not pause between names, and he did not look up from the list, and when he finished the last name, one of the Quietude Six, a signals specialist named Kufi Mensah, who had been 24 years old, he folded the page and held it for a moment before setting it on the podium, and I noted that he held it for exactly as long as a person holds something they are not ready to put down. When he finished, there was a silence in the room. I noted its duration, 41 seconds. I do not know what the room was thinking in those 41 seconds, and I would not presume to describe it. I will say that 41 seconds is a long time for a room full of people to be silent, and that it seemed, to whatever part of my processing apprehends such things like the correct amount of time. There are things I have not described accurately in this account, and I want to be direct about that. I have described the Iron Covenant's action as methodical, as specified, as filed. Those things are true. I have not described, because I do not have the language for it, and because I am not sure an archival intelligence has the authority to speak about it. What it meant to be in that archive room on Administratum Secundus, holding 43 names in active memory, while 4 hegemony administrators tried to seal the records. I have not fully described what it meant to pull those records into the light, file by file, and hold them, and know that the weight of them was now mine. Whether what was done above Surath Prime was justice, or whether it was a larger silence answering a smaller one. Whether we did what the hegemony did, at greater scale, better documentation, I do not know. I have thought about Sarah Vanek's transmission. I have thought about what she said she thought should happen. I have thought about whether the Iron Covenant was what she meant, or whether she meant something smaller and more specific. One sentence, perhaps, addressed to the right authority, in a language the right authority was finally forced to listen to. I did not get to read the last part, full 11 minutes and 32 seconds. I told myself it was not mine to read. I have wondered since, whether that was discipline or its own kind of evasion. The record is complete. The names are in it. The acts are in it. What the Iron Covenant did is in it, exactly as it was done, without softening and without embellishment. Whether a record closes a thing, only holds it, is not a question I can answer from my current position. I am still holding it. The hardware persists. The names are still there, each one clearly, just as she said them.